Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Richard Fennell. I'm the Global Training Manager at Luxion, makers of KeyShot, and today we're going to be talking all about metals. So the way we're going to start out today is I've got a couple of slides, and I want to talk about kind of our agenda and overall what the topics will be, and then we'll hop into it, and it's going to be interactive. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A session, and then also people are going to be answering questions if you type those questions into the chat. So we'll save any big questions until the end, but otherwise, feel free to chime in. And thanks to everybody who already did say hello in the chat this morning or afternoon or wherever you're at. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get into it. What we're going to talk about today are basically metals in KeyShot. There are going to be a few different materials that we talk about, but we want to talk about how metals work, some best practices whenever you're working with the metals as well as modeling. We'll talk a little bit about textures and different kinds of textures, and we'll have some examples up, and then talk about lighting, because that's going to be pretty much as important as the control over your materials, which you do have a ton of. So we want to talk about how to get the best results. Pretty common requests that we hear are things like brush metal. How do you get really great brushed metal? Or how do you control the lighting for things like chrome? Chrome, it's really easy to blow out. So we'll talk about how we can affect that material. So here's a picture of some random stuff I had in my pockets and sitting on my desk. And if you look, it's a bunch of metal. And one key thing when it comes to metal and working with metal or rendering metal is the fact that most metal is going to be highly reflective and is primarily influenced by its surroundings. So if you take a look at that paper clip or the little USB plug, you'll notice that what we see in that material is heavily influenced by what's next to it or what's around it. In a rendering that I've got here, we'll see that we've got this, kind of sphere sitting on this textured plane, and metal looks the way it does because of what's next to it. And with most KeyShot materials, it's going to be a property that we control called the specular parameter, or the color of sharp reflections. So in this scene here, we've got our environment that's in the background. We have our polished chrome that's in our kind of foreground, and then we've got our ground plane. And we know that's polished chrome just by looking at it, and that's because it's highly, highly reflective, and it's reflecting everything that's around it. We're getting a little bit more realism in the plane through some textures, but otherwise, again, it's I'll be repeating it. My apologies for that, but it's going to be really focusing in on the reflections, to really make our materials more believable. Again, that's the specular component that we'll talk about. So today we're going to talk about three basic materials. Before I hop into that, I want to show this slide that again shows you that the material and the lighting environment is what really leads to your result. So if you're unhappy with one, you're going to have to change the other to maybe get the results you're looking for. For example, if you think your brush thickness looks great, but then the lighting environment's totally blown out or looks really muddy, then you may have to change that lighting environment or go back and tweak your material. So both of these are going to be as equally important to get the best results. Geometry is still important. This is a pretty key thing. We're going to get the most realism by actually modeling in all of our details. So, for example, in this scene right here, we've got a nicely detailed model, and you'll notice that that's going to be more convincing because there are chamfers, there are rounded edges, there are radii on all of the corners, and that's really going to help with the believability. So here we did a quick rendering kind of side by side to see what that looks like. On the left-hand side, we've actually added rounded corners in our modeling software. On the right-hand side, you can see we didn't. The big difference here that you can see are the little highlights on the edges. So for example, on that chamfered edge, we know in production that would probably have a little bit of an edge on it. So adding that in is really going to help with your believability, especially when you're working with highly reflective materials like this metal that we see here. So yeah, it does start with having some good geometry. So let's talk about the different materials that we've got access to. First of all, And this is probably the most common that everybody uses in KeyShot is just the base metal material. There's a lot that we can do with this material, and there's some really cool effects that we can get out of it. But it does have the fewest options, although it can be textured to get really, really great results. So we're actually going to pop the scene open a little bit later, but we'll talk about the different types of textures and the effects that we can get. But the metal material is going to be one of the most basic. Our second material, and we'll probably come back to this slide, is going to be our metallic paint material. So this is a true layered material, and this one's a little bit more complex. Metallic paint works off of the concept of something like an automotive paint. So we've got a base paint, we have a metal flake on top of that, and then we have a clear coat. It kind of helps if you think about this material like a layered material. So this one's going to have a lot more options to it because we have minute control over essentially those three different layers. So we'll break that down and talk about all those different options. The last material that we'll cover is the anisotropic material, or what I like to refer to as the advanced metal. This is going to give you the most control over the reflection, specifically some of those hard to get material reflections like for brushed metals. This is the perfect material for rendering something like brushed metal. It's called anisotropic because of the type of reflections that we're seeing. So I rendered this out in a VR, but if you take a look at this VR right here, you'll notice that those highlights are behaving in a really interesting way, and that's anisotropic reflections, or reflections kind of biased towards a direction. So we'll break that down, because if you're trying to get any sort of brushed finish, this is going to be the absolute best material to give you that result. In this case, we've set it to a radial brush. We'll also take a look at it with linear brushes as well. But yeah, that's going to be the anisotropic material. We'll also get into lighting. There are going to be some, tips and tricks on lighting. For example, here we've got this same model side by side. So this model was provided to us by Stryker, and this one we'll actually dive into a little bit. But if you take a look at these two renderings, they're the exact same materials, no change in the materials. The only difference is the lighting environment. And if you can see the one on the left, that was rendered with the default or startup environment. The one on the right was 3 panels straight. That's the only change between those two. And the one on the right pops a lot more. We're seeing a lot more depth in the materials. It looks a lot less flat. It's got more contrast. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page there. But same materials, different lighting environment. That's the only difference between those two. And the one on the right looks significantly better. Yeah, so always to keep in mind, those two things are going to be just as important. So let's go ahead and hop into a scene, and let's talk about some materials and material properties. So I mentioned Stryker was kind enough to provide this model, so we'll use this as our starting point, and we'll start getting into some metals. Again, if you've got questions, you can plug those into the chat portion, and those will be answered while you work. Also, just as a reminder, this webinar is going to be recorded. It's going to be available on YouTube. Any files that we can share, we definitely will. We'll also post a copy of the presentation that I've been using. So all the assets you're going to get are going to be, or all the assets we're using will be available as well. Okay, so this model here, we've already applied just the basic kind of paint or plastic material to the battery compartment. And I'm working with the 3 panels environment, so I'm not using that startup. I'm kind of preempting my lighting by just using a better environment, or one that has more contrast and a better range of color or light. And then we'll use that as our starting point. The rest of this, all of these materials, we haven't actually applied any materials to our parts or our surfaces, so that's what we're going to get into. So with the KeyShot library, so over on the left-hand side, we've got our metals folder within materials. And if you've never done this, open up that little drop down next to metal, because there are a lot of different subfolders, and these are going to have further folders. So let's talk about our basic metal, because it's going to be the most common material that we find in our material library. So I'll just start with a basic chrome, and I'll drag it and drop it onto this part right here. I'm going to right click and hit look at hotkey for that, Control Alt right click. I'll be doing that while we're working. But if you take a look at this material and I double click on it, that brings up my material editor. And so these are some of the properties that we can change. For metal, it's basically going to be color and roughness. Those are our main properties, not including textures that we're going to talk about. So what I want to illustrate here is that you can see we've got a chrome, super shiny. Roughness 0 means that's a super glossy finish, basically just a mirror finish. And the color of the material is really driving what we see that material is. What I mean by that, if I go over to the colors library, there's a folder with some metal materials in it. And if I drag copper onto my material, that's going to look like copper because it's changing the specular color or the color of the reflection. So any light that hits this material is going to be tinted by copper. If I wanted to replicate brass, right, I've got a different color, and my reflections are going to be tinted by those specular highlights or those really sharp reflections. So you can always refer to these kind of colors, drag it over, apply it to my material to get whatever effect you're wanting. These colors are going to be different based on the alloy. So depending on the amount of chrome or nickel or copper, right, that's going to change the actual alloy, and it's going to change the appearance. So that's kind of that's really basic, but when we're talking about a completely untextured, totally glossy metal, then we can just apply some color to it, and that's representing our specular color or the color of sharp reflections. If I change this lighting environment really quickly here over to kind of a photographic one, you can see that we're seeing the reflections in that material, and we can change that material color to something else, and now that gives us a representation of a different material. So pretty basic stuff, but just wanted to make sure we talk about it. So what are some of the other properties that we can change with this material? Because what I'd like to do is we'll go through metal, we'll go through metallic paint and anisotropic on a material property standpoint, and then we'll swing back and talk about the textures. So first, we can change the roughness. And roughness is commonly mistaken for texture. Like if you were to think a piece of sandpaper, that kind of texture. And it's not. What the roughness slider controls is how glossy or matte the reflections are. So for example, here, roughness 0, that means a gloss value of 100. The more roughness I add, the more this actually randomizes the reflections. So you can see here, I can crank this up. And the more roughness I add, if I go all the way to the right, I've essentially made, in essence, kind of a 100% matte material. We are seeing no sharp reflections. But again, we're not actually adding any texture to it. It's not like a bump map or a normal map or something like that. We wouldn't be able to feel the texture on this surface. We're just saying, oh, okay, this material is now completely matte, not glossy at all. So that's important to keep in mind, but most materials have some little bit of texture to them, or they're not totally mirrored surfaces. So I tend to add a little bit of roughness on a lot of things just to give some imperfections. And we'll talk about adding more imperfections as well. But that's what this slider controls. Basically, it will give you more of a matte or gloss or semi-gloss finish, depending on the value that you type in here. The nice thing is you can see this in the real time, and that'll be reflected when you actually render this image out, or basically what you see is what you get in terms of roughness on the material. So that's the basics of our metal material. So I'll just set this, let's say this is going to be a steel, so I'll change that to steel. We'll keep a little bit of roughness because I think that looks good and it's representative of what this looks like in real life. And I will copy and paste the material. So if I hold down Shift, that's the equivalent of copying the material. So hold Shift and click once, left click, that's copy. Now I hold Shift and right click. That's the equivalent of paste linked material. So now I have the same material applied to both parts. So now I can just click a few parts, and now we've got our material that's linked on all those parts right there. I had already applied a basic chrome. You can see chrome polished, and I can copy this and I'll apply it to, that part there, maybe this part right here, so we can see the difference between those two materials. A question that we get every once in a while that I just want to address. I started with a chrome material here and then I made changes to it. This name doesn't really matter. I could call this whatever I want. And this material is only going to get saved to this KeyShot file unless I save it back in a material library, which I definitely recommend doing from time to time. So I could call this, let's just call this rough steel 1, just so I have that that named. But yeah, it's still a metal material, but now I've changed the color and some properties, so it's now a custom material that I've got. Let's talk about our next more advanced kind of metal material, and that's going to be metallic paint. So I'll go over to my material library, and then under the paint folder, there is a folder full of metallic paints. And again, this is a multi-layered material. So I'm going to grab this paint metal black, drag it over, and apply it to this part right here. And it looks like I just missed this little bit in here, so I will copy and paste. So those are all linked together. And let's go ahead and double click on that material and let's look at some of the material properties here. So like I mentioned before, metallic paint has got a couple different layers to it. Looks something like this. This is a really simplified version of what we've got. If I go back to my KeyShot scene, you can see I have a few more sliders and properties. So first of all, we have a base color and metal color. The way you can think of these, so our base color is that first layer of paint that gets laid down, and I will set that to black. If you're used to thinking in terms of diffuse and specular colors, which is really what these are, the diffuse color will set to black, which means that it's not going to have any, or it's going to absorb a lot of light that hits it. So metals, or most materials, tend to be split between diffuse and specular reflections. So if you're used to working with diffuse colors and specular, we'll set the base color, aka the diffuse color, to black. All right, so this doesn't look like metal yet. We'll change that. So I'll go back over to my colors and we'll take one of these. Again, we'll use copper because I think that pops really well. I'm not going to drag it directly onto the material because you'll notice that changes the base color by default. So what I'll do is I'll drag this directly over to the metal color. And now what we're saying is that we've got a base color of black, and on top we've got some copper metal flakes. Well, it still doesn't look like copper. But what we're doing here is we're defining the reflectivity, or the specularity of that material, using copper to define it. And we've got some other sliders in here. And the two big ones we want to talk about whenever we talk about our metal flake: metal coverage, metal roughness. So metal coverage, if I increase this, what we're basically doing is we're increasing the density of our metal flakes into our mix. So if I set that something like 0.95, then we have a really dense a blend of kind of our metal flakes into that paint material. So now we're seeing more of the copper color. So if I take a look at that, more copper. This metal roughness is going to control kind of the orientation of all those individual flakes. If you think that the roughness is these little bitty flakes, with a roughness value of 0, that means that all those flakes are basically coplanar. So we have like a totally smooth metal flake. So if I drop that down to 0, bam, now we've got this really strong kind of copper color. What's really cool here is that we can then fine tune exactly how much roughness we want. So we can control the interaction between that metal flake and our base color. This is going to give us a really nice deep kind of reflection. And that's actually matching pretty well side by side with our base metal material. Just to try something, I'm going to throw this copper onto that metal, and you can see that they're going to be pretty close. They're not exactly the same, but we can get a little bit more control over our metallic paint material. So metallic paint is great for working with kind of anodized looking finishes or things that have secondary coatings. But that's our metal roughness. So we can add a little bit more roughness to this material. And if I actually put these side by side and let this sit for just a second, you'll notice something interesting here between these two materials. Our metal material has just got some roughness. Our metallic paint still has our third layer of material. I'm getting sharp highlights because there's a clear coat on top. Again, going back to this image here. So that clear coat, by default, is going to give us some nice sharp reflections on top because it's a clear coat of, not paint, but it's just a clear coat on the top of the surface. If I want to get rid of that clear coat, I can add in a little bit of roughness, and I can break up those reflections of the clear coat. Right, so this will give me more of kind of a little bit more of a matte or a satin finish, right? We're getting rid of that. This is a great way to replicate like a coated or like a foil metal, something that's not actually truly metal, maybe back printed or all different types of manufacturing processes, but this is a really interesting one. So again, our clear coat roughness, we can increase that to back off our sharp reflections a little bit. This slider here, a clear coat refraction index. So you'll see this refraction index slider in a bunch of different materials. Metal generally doesn't have it because that value tends to be really high. What this value is an absolute. So someone actually measures that value. So your refraction index is very specific for salt water at 0 degrees Celsius. Wait, no, that'd be frozen. But sorry. Basically, any real material has a real life value for a refraction index. So I don't tend to mess with this very much. Plastics and paints and glass, they all have a very specific refraction index. So if you're not happy with your reflections, I generally won't mess with this one. I'll mess with my lighting environment instead. The reason I'm mentioning this is because right now we have a refraction index of paint, 1.5. If I'm truly trying to replicate something like metal, this is one of the few times I would mess with this slider. If I just crank it all the way to the right, that's going to give me some super sharp reflections, right? That's going to push me more into the metal category for my clear coat. And I'll back out on that roughness. Right? But now if I look at that, I've got super sharp reflections with a highly reflective clear coat on top. Again, that's one of the few times I do mess with that. Again, if you've got questions while we're working, go ahead and type them into the chat and then we'll answer those there. All right, so that's the metallic paint. Right? We've got all these three properties that we can control. We can control them independently. I'll back down on this one. Let's say this was going to be kind of a coated material, not real metal, like a faux metal finish. Right? And I'll change both of these back to looking more like a, actually we'll make this titanium and then we'll make this steel. And again, I'm dragging that over to the metal color. All right, so two very different materials. We're getting similar results, but one of them is going to have a little bit more control. Something that I run into regularly is, my materials get blown out. So one thing to keep in mind with either our metal or our metallic paint and then anisotropic, the metal color controls our reflections. And so if I change that metal color, instead of RGB or CMYK, I'm going to use HSV. My brain actually understands colors in HSV. This is hue, saturation, and value. So if we want to see more light reflecting off our material, increase the value, make it brighter. You can see here, now I'm blowing that material out. If you want to decrease the reflections on that material, I can back down on that value or darken it. What we're doing here is we're controlling the amount and the color of light that's reflecting off that material. That's what the specular component controls. So now if we decrease that, it's getting less blown out. Looks good. I just backed it down a little bit, but now I don't have that totally blown out material. It's a little bit softer, and I still get the right color and I get the right impression that I want. And then you can still go tweak the lighting on this one. Okay, so we've got our metallic paint. And again, we will get into textures on all this stuff. The last material I want to address is the anisotropic material. So what the heck does that mean? What is the anisotropic material? This is going to be our most advanced metal material. It's going to give you control over highlights and reflections to a higher degree. We will, let me see, let's go ahead and apply that on this back part right here, and we'll take a look at that. And we'll open another scene and kind of focus on brushed metal. But for now, I just want to talk about the anisotropic material. So just like this material, I still have the metallic paint up. You can see the material type is metallic paint. you can always change the material type using this dropdown. So what I'm going to do is I'll leave that material alone for now. I'll go back to my material library. And this is how I tend to work a lot. I'll start with a simple material. For example, like this. I'll start with chrome black. I'll apply it to this part, and I will copy and paste that material. So now it's linked on these two parts. And I'll double click on this material to edit it, or you can right click and hit edit material. Now we're modifying that material. So you can see the material type is metal. Let's go ahead and change that material type. And you can do, again, you can do this anytime, but I'm going to change it to this anisotropic material, or our advanced metal. You'll see here that we get some other properties that you may have never noticed if you haven't played with this material type. And what I'm going to do, just so we can see this a little bit better for now, is to put this into one of our photo environments that has a lot of reflections, has a lot of stuff going on. So here, you'll notice I have a base color, and I will set that to pure black. And we have our specular color. This is the color of our sharp reflections. This is our metal kind of reflections. So just so we can see it again like we did before, I'll throw on copper. So now we're getting these really, really nice bright reflections. This is where this material has some very unique properties. If you take a look at this, we don't have general roughness. Our roughness is controlled on the X and Y. So what does that mean? Let's back both of these down to 0. And if you take a look at the reflections of the material, we can see the reflections of our environment. Well, if I grab one of these sliders and drag it, you'll see that we can bias the reflection. So first, let's try roughness X, and let's throw in a little bit of roughness in the X. If you look at those reflections, we're now starting to see kind of streaks in the reflections because we're saying there's more roughness in the X direction. Whereas if I throw in some roughness in the Y, watch what happens here, those highlights are going to go vertical. So this is a really great example because now we can see those reflections are being biased in some direction because we've got roughness X and roughness Y. Anybody who's tried to render brushed metals, and if you haven't used the anisotropic materials, I could understand that you'd run into some potential frustration trying to get that result, because that is a very specific result, and this is the only material that will get you that result. So in this case, let's say we were trying to replicate something like a brushed stainless. I would, so brush metals are generally, the anisotropic reflections will generally be perpendicular to the brush direction. So if you've got horizontal brushing, your highlights are going to run vertical and vice versa. So let's say this part, we're not texturing it yet, but if we wanted to throw some brush textures on here and they were going to be horizontal, well then we'd want to make sure our highlights are running vertical. So we can do that right here. So roughness Y, if I type in something like 0.1, now I get these really strong reflections up and down. And roughness X, I'll usually type in just a little bit to help break up those reflections with a kind of a linear brush. But the takeaway here is to set these two at different values, and generally a big difference between the two. So I have 0.01 over for the Y, and then I have 0.001 for the X. Or if I said 0.01, I've got 0.1 and 0.001. There's a big difference between those two, and that's what's going to give me those nice sharp reflections in one direction. I can also tweak the angle on this material. So if I, let's say for whatever reason that was brushed at a 45 degree, well then now my reflections are going to be angled as well. So you do have a little bit of control over that. And lastly, and really importantly, there's a mode dropdown. And what this dropdown controls is the direction of the your X, Y. Excuse me. So by default, it's a linear mode. If you do UV mapping, you can drop that in. What we can also do is define a radial mode. So linear, X, Y, right? Radial, what that will do is, I don't see anything happening just yet, but we have a position button for radial. And watch what happens if I click on position, and now I click right here in the center. And hit the little green checkbox. Now what we've done is we've dictated that we have a radial anisotropic reflection. This is how we get the same result that you see with like a spin finish or vinyl, or the bottom of a CD or DVD or Blu-ray, right? But that's how we're going to get this type of reflection. And with the radial, I don't tend to have roughness in both. I'll just have it in one direction. So now roughness X of 0, roughness Y of 0.1. Now I'm seeing those really sharp kind of radial reflections. And if I rotate the environment around, I'm doing that by holding control and clicking and dragging my real-time view. You can see that I'm getting that really nice, bright kind of burst pattern. And bear in mind, for the anisotropic material, we still have yet to texture it. We haven't touched the brush textures on this at all yet. What we're saying is, on a material level, this is how light is handled. We're determining it using our roughness and our mode. So pretty big deal if you've messed with kind of brush metals or been frustrated trying to get that result. So again, still no textures on it, but we're getting a nice, strong radial reflection on that material itself. I'll change that color to something like, let's say on the back, that was stainless steel. We'll drop it in just so it's a little bit less biased towards that color. Again, if you're seeing some kind of reflections that are a little bit too sharp, if it's a little bit blown out, well, we can always decrease the specularity or the reflectivity of that material. So now, hopefully we're getting it a little bit less blown out. In this case, because we've got a bright metal next to a window, we're always going to have to deal with the fact that we're going to have some really strong reflections. There's no getting around that unless we modify our lighting environment. But that reflects real world. If we actually take this and put a shiny material into a bright room and you try to take a picture of it, that picture will always have a little bit that's blown out, unless you get really, really fancy with your photography. In our case, we can modify the lighting environment. So that actually looks pretty nice, but we've got our spun or our radial directional roughness using the anisotropic material. I think that's good for now. We'll just copy and paste a couple of other materials just so this looks a little more defined. And I'll put this back into a studio environment, our 3 panels. That color mismatch I actually don't like, so I will select this part here. I'm going to unlink that material. I can also do that by right-clicking and unlinking. And let's make sure that these 2 colors match up, because that would probably be the same material there. So I'll just throw in steel, and that looks a little bit better. There we go. So that's a little bit better matching. Now you can see there's a big difference between those 2 materials. I can hit C on my keyboard, C for color, to set my background as white. And so now if I rotate my environment around, you can see that I've got a decent looking model for not having done too much to it, right? We've just customized some of the materials. So I'll go ahead and pause this one, Shift P on my keyboard, because I want to get into a little bit of texturing. There's a model I've already prepped, and this will be available online as well. You can, at least on the Windows side, you can run KeyShot in 2 sessions side by side. If you do that, make sure you pause whatever session you're not using. And I'll hit F to go into full screen. So let's get into textures. We've got a bunch of different types of textures, and in this case, we've got them all out. So this scene will be available for download. All of these just have the basic metal material, but what I want to do is talk a little bit about some different textures and some techniques that we can use. What was done here was this was imported as one single part. We applied just a 50% metal to it, so it's a metal 50% gray, no roughness, and then just applied it on the first part, or actually on all of them, and then we went in and we tweaked all of those materials. So let's take a look at some of these materials. This is just a basic metal, no textures, nothing fancy going on with this one. That's it, pretty straightforward. Let's talk about some of our other materials. So next to it, we have the same exact material, and the only difference between the 2 is the roughness. In this one, we added 0.05 for roughness. So if I drop that back down to 0, it looks exactly the same. But what we're doing with the roughness, again, we're not actually adding texture. We're saying that this is more of a satin finish as opposed to a completely glossy finish. And if I put these side by side, you can see the difference between the two. But again, no texture on this second metal bar, right? We're just changing those reflections up a little bit. By the way, got a question, what environment is being used? The environment is one that was created by Maxime Mraz, and I'll show you where you can find this one later. That won't be included in the KeyShot file, but I can show you where you can find it. This third bar over here, now let's start getting into textures, because no roughness, a little bit of roughness. Now let's throw some textures on here, and let's actually look at these side by side. If you do a comparison between these two parts, you'll notice this material actually has some texture, and that's looking really nice. We're using one of my favorite textures, a noise texture under the bump. So bump textures change the way the light bounces off the surface. Basically, they give that material the appearance of kind of peaks and valleys, and we can use tons of different bump textures. This bump texture, I'll temporarily throw it over to color, but what it is it's just noise, right? So it's just black and white pixels just kind of blending together. If I throw that onto the bump, and that's a noise texture, you can apply it using this drop down right here. It is not an image, it's a mathematical model, right? But that's our noise texture. And that's gonna give you kind of a nice random pattern. A lot of molded plastics, paints that don't have a clear coat, silicone, anodized finishes. There is a whole laundry list of materials that are going to have just a little bit of a subtle texture to them, and I achieve that using our noise texture. I use this one all the time. If you haven't played with this before, you can simply, if I get rid of it, right, and I don't have a bump texture applied to it, and you can see here, it looks exactly like the material next to it. I'll select bump, hit the drop down, and I will add in a noise texture. Right, and this one I've scaled down. Let's do something like 0.1, and we can control the bump height, something like 0.2. So now the difference between the peaks and the valleys has been increased. But this is a way that you can get some really, really super textures on stuff, those really kind of fine textures, and that really improves the realism. So that's our noise texture that we've applied to that. So metal with noise bump. All right, our fourth little part right here, this is going to get us into a really interesting category of textures, and actually a new texture type for KeyShot 6. So if I double click on this material, you'll notice that I've got my color still 50%, but now the roughness, this icon has changed and my slider has gone away. If you don't use the anisotropic material, all you can do is control the general roughness, just how satin the overall material is. Here what we can do, actually in almost any material, wherever you see this little icon, that means we've applied a texture to that property, or we can apply the texture to that property. So what I've done here is I've adjusted the surface roughness, and I've defined it using a texture. So in this case, it's camouflage. Kind of crazy, but bear with me. What we can do is we can think, if we want to texture a material, and I'll go back to this part over here, we've got a roughness slider, and we can control that numerically. What we can also do is control it with a texture. So I'll go over to my textures folder, and if I type in something like a mesh into my textures, you'll see that here I have a circular mesh. So we have black dots on a white background. If I drag it over to the material, it thinks I want to apply it as a color texture. I don't. What I want to do is apply it to my roughness. Right? And now take a look at my surface, and I'll click on that texture and I'll scale it down a little bit. What roughness textures do, it's like an in-mold kind of pattern. It's saying that wherever our image is black, we have a roughness of 0. Glossy, smooth, perfect. Wherever we have roughness of white, we have a roughness value of 1, which is super rough, right? We're getting more of a matte reflection. And this is very different than a specular texture. A specular texture controls the reflectivity. What we're doing here is we're controlling the roughness. So if I condense the mapping, you can see my texture has a brightness slider. And if I decrease that brightness, I'm making it darker. Therefore, I'm making it less rough. So if I type in something like 0.1, or sorry, 0.01. You can see the black can't get darker, so it stays smooth and perfectly shiny. But now anywhere else that was white is now darker, so there's less roughness. Kind of an out there concept. But what we can do, again, is we can really specify the roughness of our material. This example here, this little metal bar, what we've done is, if I double click on it, I've gone in and I've used some really subtle grayscale values to randomize the roughness of that material. So it's being randomized all over the place using this camouflage texture. So that's one that's available as a procedural texture, and you can see their camo. So if I go back to this one, if we wanted to try to replicate something like that, I can right click on that little node, and it's kind of hidden in here. This is a cool little feature, but I can delete a texture, or in this case, I can right click on it and I can add a texture, and I will add a camouflage texture. Now you can see what that looks like with kind of the default settings. Normally, we use that as a texture to make it look like camo. But now what we're doing is we're defining the roughness using color values. And even though these are green, it's just pulling the grayscale value. So I'll go over to my colors. We've got some grayscale, so you can see 0 is black, which means it's perfectly smooth and shiny. And we'll throw in a couple of different grayscale values to represent varying amounts of roughness on the surface. And now we have a pretty slick looking material, right? We've got this crazy kind of camo. And again, that's with roughness. That's like if you bead blasted with varying grain sizes or types of bead, whether it's metal or glass or whatever, right? So the way I got that other effect was I hit the mix color slider and I increase the spray, which starts blending those together a little bit better. But again, roughness textures, they're awesome. They're really, really cool. Another more advanced texture that we can use with our metal materials, if I double click on this one, if you take a look at it, we have this really interesting, same pieces of geometry, no faces were broken out, but now we have the color changing on the edges. So you can see here that I've got a texture applied, and that's applied as a color texture. And what we're using is curvature. What we're saying is that we are controlling the color of our material based off the curves of the surface. And this is kind of crazy. So what I'll do is I'll go back to, I'll use this first one kind of as my guinea pig, right? I'll grab just a basic chrome and I'll apply it, and let's look at that corner. I'll double click on this material, go to my textures, and then hit the drop down for material color and use curvature. What we're saying here is we can define the color of our material by the curves on the surface. Anything that's flat, right? 0 curvature. Let's change this to green so we can see it pop. Anything that's flat is 0 curvature. Anything that's positive curvature, let's change this to a brighter blue, like our rounded corners, that's now blue. And we won't see anything here because I don't have any negative curvature. We would need like a concave surface. On the inside, it would be red, these curves. But anything that's curved inward is red. This cutoff slider controls the cutoff between our colors. This is how we can fine tune basically the kind of strength or the cutoff between what's flat and what's got some curve to it. So we can use this on almost any material. You can use this for paint or plastic. In this case, we're using it for metal. But what we're saying is we're changing the material color based on the surface curvature. Okay, so the way that this was used in that other material is we can throw, let's say, 50% gray onto 0 curvature, or where this piece of geometry is flat. Now all we see is the blue. Now if I go to my metallic colors, I'll grab that same copper. I just like using it because it pops, but I'll throw the copper in as positive curvature. And now you can see anywhere that's not flat, we're seeing copper, and we can control how much of the copper we see using our cutoff slider. Right? So all we've done on this one is applied a curvature to the color. And I think on that other material, I'd applied just a little bit of roughness as well. Right now we're breaking up those reflections a little bit more, and we're getting that really nice kind of worn or patina look. So yeah, that's how that material was done, and that's pretty neat. So again, these were all using the base material of metal, and we can do some really cool stuff with the texturing. This file will be saved. We'll also throw these materials into the cloud, so anything with these names, I'll try to make sure we upload those to the cloud, and then we'll also make this KSP file handy. But our other textures in here, let's talk about these, because again, these can go a bunch of different directions. I'll double click on this material here, because this is one that we get the request for. How do you get like a machined finish and kind of a final rendering? I flashed it for just a second up here, but on this plate on this watch, right? It's got these kind of nice grooves that were machined in. I know that one was made using the wood texture as a bump. So we just have a metal material with a little bit of roughness, and what we'll do here is I'll actually reset it so we can see how this was made from the beginning, but I'll use the bump and I'll use the drop down and hit wood. And when I do this, you'll see that this is a procedural or mathematically based wood texture. It's not an image. If I throw it on a color, you can see that I have this weird metal wood grain, but I want to use it as bump. If you think of the wood, it's like a series of concentric cylinders that extend to infinity. And for most of the procedural textures, there'll be some noise control. Noise is randomness. So you'll see ring, axial, and color noise. I'm going to drop all of these to 0. And now you can see I'm getting perfectly concentric circles on my top surface. And I can change the scale on these. So drop that down. And now I'm getting a nice fine radial, kind of a radial machine finish. So a circular finish. If I want to reposition the center point, I can use the mapping tool and change the center point. Also, it's often overlooked, but there's a position button. If I click on position, I can click to recenter that texture. And if I click on position again, you'll notice my move tool has jumped to wherever I click. But this is how we can get those nice machine finishes. If I decrease the roughness, now it's super smooth and glossy, but that's something that would be total overkill to model and a pain to get with an image texture. Yeah, so that's our radial machine. We'll also have a Q&A session after the webinar. I just want to keep moving here. And let's talk for just a second about this material. So if I double click on it, you can see that I have a metal material, no color bump or opacity textures. What I've done is I've added a brush texture to the roughness parameter. So again, no roughness slider. So just like we did earlier with our roughness, we can define how rough that material is. We can't change the direction of the highlights like we can with the anisotropic, which we'll be getting to in just a minute. But we can add roughness in some direction. So the default, whenever you throw this on, we'll just we'll set that back to let's say we change that to brushed, and let's see what the default looks like. Okay, so it's too big. We can scale that down, and then I think in this one we rotate it at 90 degrees, and you'll notice that the brush texture has two colors. So roughness of black means smooth, white means completely rough, totally matte. So we'll change that and we'll drop it down to a darker gray. And now we're getting an interesting texture. And it's kind of a way of getting like a faux brush texture, or anything that has a secondary process like a black stainless. But yeah, so that's applied as a brush roughness texture. All right, the other ones here, I'll kind of zip through these. Again, you can download this KeyShot file later. This has got an image texture applied for both bump and roughness. So this is what happens when you start layering your materials. This is kind of a rust texture that's currently applied to roughness. So here you can see we're breaking up those reflections with an image on the roughness. And if that same image is now applied to the bump, now we start getting some kind of cracks and crevices in there to accompany our roughness. And this is what gives you some really, really slick results. That first image that I showed with the chrome ball on a textured kind of ground plane, this one over here, That's used, or this was created using that technique of a bump texture plus a color texture plus a roughness texture. And all three were from polygon.com, Two Eyes in Polygon. I'll show you that website later. But yeah, so there we go. This material over here has got some scratches in it applied to the bump. This one has these kind of dimples, and that's applied to the bump, and that's using the procedural mesh, so math-based mesh in your scene. Right, so I just wanted to show you some of the possibilities you have with the texture. So we talked about roughness, we talked a little bit about bump. You can take this in a ton of different directions, and you've got so much control with the materials once you really start getting into the texturing. Okay, so I'll pause this for just a second, and lastly, let's talk about our brush finishes, because this is important, and we're going to use the anisotropic material in order to get the result that we want here. So let's open another KSP file. Just a KeyShot file. I've already started working on this one. It's definitely not done, but the reason for that is we want to apply some material. So I'll hide some parts, and I'll also just throw this in performance mode so this goes a little bit faster. But let's apply some quick materials here, because I do want to talk about our brushed metals, because there's going to be some interesting techniques for them. First, we'll apply some quick material. So chrome, I'll apply it to the end caps here, and you can see a bunch of those are linked. So we're good there. I'll throw chrome onto the oven racks, so we're good there. Now we want to work with kind of our brushed metals. So instead of working from a material from the material library, I'm a little pickier, so we'll just get one of these chromes, and we'll throw it onto our door right here. And I'll also change this to an environment that's got a little bit more going on so we can see those reflections. So again, that apartment, we'll use that one again. And I'm going to zoom in on this material. So what we're going to do here, double click on that metal material, and we're going to change the material type, and we're going to change it to the anisotropic material. So our more advanced material. And now you can see it's weird looking and totally blown out. Well, part of that has to do with our base color. For metals, we want to set the diffuse color or the base color to black or a very dark value. Metals are inherently reflective. They rely primarily off the specular color. So now we have kind of a rough-ish looking metal. So if I drop the roughness values to 0, now we have chrome. So a little bit of chrome in there. Let's say this is going to be a brush material, so let's now fine-tune our roughness. This is going to be a horizontal brush finish. So what we'll do is we'll make the reflections go vertical. So we're adding in roughness in the Y, and let's punch this up to 0.1. So now, no textures, we're getting those really strong reflections like we would with the brush texture. And I'll throw in just a tiny bit of roughness in X to help break those up a little bit better. Okay, so now we have the reflections that we want, but it doesn't actually look like a brush finish because we don't have a brush texture. Let's go over to our textures tab, or we could also add them right here. But what we want to do is we want to load in a specular texture. We don't want to use color, and we don't generally want to use bump. And this is where you want to use the anisotropic to get this level of control. I'll select specular. I'm going to use the drop down right here, and we're going to select brushed for our 2D procedural texture. First, let's scale that down a little bit. So let's type in 0.1. That looks a little bit better. Actually, let's do 0.2 so we see it a little bit more. And let's change our angle to 90. So now we're getting our horizontal brushing with our vertical highlights. What we're doing now, instead of using one color to define the reflectivity or the specular component, we're using two, color 1 and color 2. So to get something like stainless, what I'll generally do is I'll change both. Don't keep them at the default of black and white. Let's grab something like steel, and I'll drag it over to color 1. And you can see immediately that looks better because I'm now saying that's a somewhat reflective material. Our overall color is kind of an average of color 1 and color 2. So that steel's a little bit warm. You know, if you were using something like a chrome steel, you'd make it a little bit cool depending on what type of grade of stainless you're using. But what I'll generally do is make sure that these are really similar colors. So hue 25, saturation 4, value of 79. I'll change both of these to the same color. We won't see anything interesting here, but I'm going to change them, right? So now Color 1, let's set that to like 85 or even 90. And for color 2, let's set that to 65. So we're controlling the reflectivity of our material using two colors. The more contrast you have in the colors, the more contrast you see in the grain. So if I want to make that a little bit finer grain, then I can make those closer in value. So let's say 75. So the average color is like an 85% because we have 95 and 75. So the average is 85. We have an 85% reflective material. And now you can see vertical highlights, horizontal grain, and we're using that brush texture. That's pretty much how we can build our more advanced brush finishes. We've got some other parts in here. So let's define some reflectivity for those. And we'll keep our kind of warm lighting. But let's talk about this part right here because we'll use our radial brush. I will copy this linear brush and apply it to this part back here. And I won't paste a linked material. I'll paste an unlinked material. And I'll double click on this part. I'll go into my textures and I'm going to junk my linear brush because I don't want a linear brush. I want this to be one of those nice spun finishes. So now for this material, I'll change it to radial. And I'll click, oh, it almost hit the center, but I'll hit position. Now I can click on the center of my geometry. And now I'm getting that nice radial finish here on my clock. Let's go to the textures. We want to actually add in our brush texture again as specular, not color or bump. I'll use the 3D radial texture or a 3D radial brush. And let's scale this up so we can see it. Scale it up to 100. Nope, wrong place. So I'll use the mapping tool and I'll just try clicking. How's that working for us? Click to position. There we go. I hit my little green checkbox, and now we have our spun texture. I'll add in a little bit of angular noise to break that up a little bit more. And again, let's say this is actually going to be a little bit different color, but we'll change color 1 and color 2, and I'll darken one of those, right? But now we're getting the anisotropic reflections that we need, and then we're getting the texture on top. And that's how you get a nice kind of radial spun brush texture. We'll also make this one available for download for the sake of time. I'm just going to skip through our knobs and our handles, but for these, you'll notice what's done on the material standpoint is this knob, they're all broken into different colors. Actually, no, we're not going to skip it. I'll just copy this material and I'll paste it here because for this material, we want to make sure that our brush direction is vertical. So I'll go back to my texture and we'll rotate that because we had to rotate originally, set that back to 90, right? But now we can make sure that our brush direction is vertical. It's perpendicular to our control panel here, but now our brush is going up and down. And I can copy and paste that material to the other knob. And then for the kind of our part around the knobs, I can copy this material. I'll paste an unlinked version of that material. Right, and I'll make sure my brush direction gets changed here. Let's say that's 90. Cool, that looks good. And I will copy and paste it over to this part here. If I really wanted my materials to match this chrome part, I wouldn't use a chrome material. I could paste a material, unlinked, get rid of my roughness and my textures. And now I have an anisotropic material next to these two. And I know the overall reflectivity of these is probably in the 70s, let's say 75%. So now that's going to match a little better. Get out of performance mode, and now we can see those materials all working together. And I'll just randomly copy and paste here. Right click, show all my parts. And so now I've got my metal wall oven. And again, we can get more control over the materials to cut down on reflections that are too sharp. We can also change our lighting environment. I do want to talk just briefly about our lighting environment. A couple quick slides here just for handy reference. So we'll skip through these. Let's talk about our lighting because lighting, again, is basically as important as the materials. Here you can see that same comparison, same materials, different environment. If you're working with lighting, If you've got KeyShot Pro, this is going to basically be the best case scenario for getting the results you want, because that same part or that same model was rendered using a custom environment, so we can go in and use our pins. Another trick that we can do in order to get better reflections, and we'll show that over here, is we can modify our environment to get better reflections. Let's say we don't want our studio shot. We want this to be a little bit more realistic lighting. Go to the environment tab and I get my interiors. I'll start with this kind of conference room. And if I hit E to show the environment, you can see that I've got this conference room. What you'll notice here is, well, one, the lighting sources, this has a bunch of different light sources, so it actually is going to be really good for what we're doing. But it tends to be really warm. If I put this on a white background, you'll see how warm it is. And the reflections can be a little bit distracting. So a trick that I tend to use is if you go to the environment tab, and this is a pro feature, but if you use the HDRI editor, we can try to make some adjustments to this environment so it's a little bit better to use. In this case, what we can do is change the saturation, right? So here we can decrease the amount of color. So now we're getting less color information. You can see if I crank up the saturation, it's really going to make all the reds redder, blues bluer, all that kind of stuff. In this case, we want to back out on the saturation. So we're getting less color. And I want to back out on the reflections a little bit. So I'm going to blur the environment instead of messing with my materials, because Chrome, a lot of times people don't like the reflections you get in Chrome, but Chrome is inherently kind of a perfect finish. So instead of messing with Chrome, we will blur the environment. And if I hit the little refresh button, that's going to give us our full res environment. But now if I just hit C and go back to color, and I can rotate this a little bit, right now we're getting a better image because we've gotten rid of the color information inherent to that environment and cut the color out and blurred it to give us, I wouldn't call this a studio setup, but this is a little bit more interesting and definitely going to make our product look better if we want that kind of studio shot. So saturation and blurring the environment is going to be huge. And here's that exact same example on the left with the default environment, nothing tweaked. On the right, that same conference room, all we did was blur it and desaturate it, no rotating or anything like that. And the one on the right is going to be a much, much nicer looking image. So kind of to tie this together, we've talked about materials. I know we quickly talked about the lighting environment. One of the keys takeaways there is just getting rid of some of the lighting or some of the color and reflections in your environment, if that's a concern. And that's how we're going to achieve our optimal result. At some point, actually, what I'll do is I'll prep this oven file and make sure that it also has a custom environment using the lighting environment, because that's the best way to get more control over your lighting, is actually going in, dropping in pins and highlights and things like that. So we'll make that scene available so you can kind of break it down. But otherwise, we'll open up for questions at the end. I do want to bring, actually, I want to show you a couple of resources that you've got. And these are pretty key. First, our blog. It's funny that, well, it's actually not funny, it's on purpose. But if you go to keyshot.com/blog, you can always find out more information here. And one of the most recent tips that we have is how to render brush metals in KeyShot. So this actually takes you through what we did today. And there's a little bit more detail in here. So if things like brush metals are important to you, take a look, because this actually walks through step by step. The roughness, different colors that you can use, neutral colors, cool, warm, varying amounts of contrast in the colors. This also has kind of a primer on your radial finishes, and there's an interactive VR to show those kind of anisotropic reflections. Plus, you can download a stainless steel tumbler scene that we've prepped. So take a look at the blog. There's some really good content in there and specific to metals. There's one for roughness textures, so take a look at that one. That's a good primer. And the difference between roughness and bump. So that's another really good one. You can see here kind of a breakdown of the roughness and how it's different from bump. And so this is a really, really good reference or asset that you guys have available to you. So that's going to be the blog. Also, take a look at our forum. So this shot right here, these are a bunch of images that are in our forum. So if you go to keyshot.com/forum, I just pulled some interesting examples of some metal materials, and so there's some really slick stuff going on here, lots of different techniques. So if you want to know more about this, that's all on our forum. And I just wanted to show polygon.com. So you can always find textures in the KeyShot Cloud library, but I wanted to call out Polygon because they've got some incredibly nice textures. So 2 eyes in Polygon, but I used some of their textures in some of the examples that I showed. And then additionally, if you'd like some more lighting environments, check out Maxime Raz's website. I got some of the HDRIs that I used from him. There's a free pack, which is wonderful here. There's also another pack for purchase, and these are really, really high quality, so I really like those. But that's it for me. So if you're watching, thank you very much for watching. Definitely keep in mind that you can find out more information at keyshot.com/learning. So take a look at all the learning content we have there. Additionally, if you go to youtube.com/KeyShot3D, we have more quick tips, tutorials, webinars recorded. This one also, again, will be recorded and posted online so that you can watch it later. But yeah, definitely take advantage of that. There's a ton of learning content. I appreciate everybody chiming in and especially asking questions throughout. We'll have a Q&A session afterwards. But thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more KeyShot content. Thank you very much.